The first time I heard the words mentally incompetent spoken about me, I was sitting in a courtroom that smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. My hands were steady. That's what I remember most. Steady. Not shaking. Not trembling. Just resting calmly on the table as if they belonged to someone else. The judge adjusted his glasses and read from the petition in a neutral, almost bored tone. Petition to declare the respondent mentally unfit to manage financial affairs. Respondent. That was me. Then he said the names of the petitioners. My mother. My father. For a second I genuinely thought I had misheard him. But when I turned my head slightly, I saw them sitting across the aisle. My mother's eyes were glossy, like she was the one being hurt. My father stared down at a folder in his lap as if it contained something too heavy to look at directly. $4 million. That was what this was about. My late husband's estate. The number had been repeated so many times over the past 3 months that it no longer sounded real. It sounded fictional. Unreal. Like something that belonged in a headline, not in my life. But nothing about that courtroom felt fictional. I had buried my husband 93 days earlier. 93. I counted because the grief had turned time into something sharp and measurable. Every day since his death had felt like walking across broken glass barefoot. And yet somehow, in the middle of all that grief, my own parents had found the time to build a legal case claiming I was too unstable to handle my own affairs. The judge continued reading. Allegations include severe emotional instability, impaired judgment, and inability to manage significant financial assets. Severe emotional instability. My husband had died suddenly. A cardiac arrest that came without warning. He was 42. Healthy. Successful. The kind of man who double-checked the smoke detectors and never missed a tax deadline. The kind of man who built a life carefully, responsibly. He left everything to me. Every property. Every investment account. His business shares. The life insurance policy. He trusted me. That was what hurt the most. Because now my parents were telling a court that he shouldn't have. 3 months earlier at his funeral, they had stood beside me as I accepted condolences. My mother had squeezed my hand and whispered, "We'll help you through everything." My father had handled small logistics, speaking softly to the funeral director, telling me not to worry about paperwork. Looking back now, I wonder when the shift happened. Was it the day the estate attorney confirmed the total value? Was it when they realized I wasn't adding their names to anything? Or had this been forming long before he died? The petition claimed I had been unable to function normally since the loss. That I was isolating myself. That I had exhibited erratic decision-making. I had cried. Yes, I had struggled to sleep. I had ignored phone calls sometimes. But grief is not insanity. Grief is not incompetence. And I had continued paying bills. Responding to emails. Meeting with the estate attorney. Reviewing financial statements. I had done everything required of me, even when doing so felt like dragging my heart through concrete. Yet here I was, listening to a lawyer hired by my own parents argue that I needed a court-appointed guardian to manage my inheritance. A guardian, which meant they would control everything. My home, my accounts, my decisions, my life. The worst part wasn't the accusation. It was the calmness in their strategy. This wasn't emotional panic. This was structured, documented, filed properly, supported with evidence. They had attached copies of text messages where I admitted I felt overwhelmed. Emails where I wrote, "I don't know how to do this without him." Therapy appointment confirmations. Normal grief had been repackaged as instability. I shifted slightly in my seat as their attorney finished speaking. My own lawyer leaned toward me and whispered, "Stay steady. This is thinner than it looks." Thinner than it looks. I hoped he was right. Because if the judge agreed with them, even temporarily, control of the estate could be frozen. Decisions paused. Counts monitored. My autonomy questioned publicly. And once a label like that is attached to you, mentally unfit, it doesn't disappear quietly. The judge looked over the top of his glasses. "Given the size of the estate in question," he said slowly, "this court will require a formal psychological evaluation before making any determination." There it was. An evaluation. My parents' plan had worked enough to bring me here. I didn't cry. I didn't react. But inside something shifted. This wasn't grief anymore. This was war. As we stood to leave, my mother finally looked at me directly. Her expression was soft, almost pleading. "This is for your own good," she whispered. I held her gaze for a long second, and in that moment I knew something with absolute clarity. They thought I was too broken to fight back. They were wrong. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I had already started collecting proof. And I hadn't started that collection yesterday. I had started it the day I noticed the first red flag. The first red flag didn't look like a red flag at all. It looked like concern. It was the afternoon after the estate attorney confirmed the total value of everything Daniel had left behind. I remember the exact moment because my mother went unusually quiet when she heard the number. $4,112,000. The room had been silent for a few seconds after the attorney said it. I was still processing the fact that my husband's entire life, his work, his discipline, his planning, had been reduced to a financial summary. But my mother wasn't grieving in that moment. She was calculating. I didn't see it then. I see it now. Later that evening she called me. "Honey," she said gently, "that's a lot for one person to manage alone." I told her I had an estate attorney and a financial advisor Daniel trusted. She paused. "Well, maybe your father should at least look over the accounts. Just to protect you." Protect me. That word kept repeating. Over the next week, the questions became more specific. Do you know all the passwords? Who has signing authority? What if someone takes advantage of you? You're not sleeping well. Are you sure you're thinking clearly? Each question was framed as care. Each suggestion sounded reasonable on its own, but taken together they formed a pattern. They wanted access, not information. Access. One afternoon, my father showed up at my house unannounced with a folder. "I drafted a temporary financial oversight agreement," he said casually, as if he were offering to water my plants. Oversight. The document would have given him co-signing authority on certain accounts, until I was emotionally stable. I stared at the paper. Why would I need this? I asked. He sighed heavily, like I had disappointed him. "Because you're not yourself." That sentence stayed with me. Not yourself. Grief had made me quieter, slower, less social. But I was functioning. I was paying utilities, reviewing investment portfolios, meeting legal deadlines. Yet somehow in their narrative sadness had become incompetence. I didn't sign the document. That was the first moment I saw a flicker of something sharp behind my father's eyes. Not concern. Frustration. From that day forward I started paying closer attention. The second red flag came 2 weeks later. I received an automated security alert from one of Daniel's investment accounts. There had been a login attempt from an unfamiliar device. When I contacted the brokerage firm, they told me someone had attempted to answer security questions incorrectly. The questions weren't random. They were personal. My mother would have known the answers. Or thought she did. I didn't accuse her. I didn't confront anyone. I simply made a note. Date. Time. Institution contacted. Then I changed every password. I enabled two-factor authentication on everything. And I stopped discussing finances around them. The shift in their behavior was subtle but immediate. My mother became more emotional during visits. She would sigh dramatically and say things like, "I barely recognize you anymore." My father began speaking about me in the third person when relatives were around. "She's struggling more than she admits. She forgets things. She's overwhelmed." They were planting seeds. Carefully. Strategically. I only fully understood what they were doing when my cousin called me one night. "Are you okay?" she asked cautiously. "Of course," I said. "Why?" She hesitated. "Aunt Lisa mentioned you've been having episodes." Episodes. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What kind of episodes?" "She said you've been erratic. That she's worried you might hurt yourself financially." There it was. The narrative was expanding. They weren't just positioning themselves legally. They were preparing witnesses. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. I replayed every recent interaction, every conversation, every comment. This wasn't random. It was coordinated. The third red flag came disguised as help. My mother insisted on attending my next therapy appointment, for support. I declined. She pushed harder. It might help the therapist understand the full picture. The full picture. As if my grief required external interpretation. That night, I opened my laptop and began organizing everything. Text messages where my father asked about account balances. Emails where my mother suggested transferring funds for safekeeping. Voicemails hinting I wasn't coping well. I created folders. I labeled timelines. I wrote summaries. Not because I thought I would need them, but because something inside me, something instinctive, knew this was escalating. 2 days later, I was served with the petition. The official document claimed I had demonstrated emotional volatility, impaired financial judgment, withdrawal from family support systems. Withdrawal. They framed my refusal to give them access as isolation. They framed boundaries as instability. They framed grief as mental decline. But what stunned me most was the attached evidence. Screenshots of private texts. Notes from conversations I never realized they were documenting. They had been building this case quietly while hugging me at the funeral. That realization hurt more than the accusation itself. I wasn't blindsided. I was betrayed in slow motion. And as I sat there reading the petition line by line, I felt something unexpected rise inside me. Not panic. Not despair. Clarity. If they were documenting me, I would document them. If they were constructing a narrative, I would dismantle it piece by piece. Because now I understood something important. This wasn't about protecting me. This was about control. And the more I reviewed their timeline, the more one question kept resurfacing. Why were they so desperate? That answer came to me 1 week later. Completely by accident. And once I saw it, everything changed. I found the answer by mistake. It wasn't some dramatic confrontation or secret confession. It was a simple envelope that wasn't meant for me. My parents had asked me to stop by their house to talk calmly. I almost didn't go. But part of me still hoped there had been some misunderstanding. Some emotional overreaction that could be undone with one honest conversation. When I arrived, my father was in the backyard pretending to fix something that didn't need fixing. My mother was in the kitchen making tea she wouldn't drink. The tension was thick. While she stepped into the hallway to take a phone call, I sat at the kitchen table. That's when I saw it. An envelope half hidden under a stack of mail. Bright red lettering. Final notice. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The return address was from a credit card company. Beneath it were 2 more envelopes, one from a mortgage lender, another from a business loan office. My father had owned a small distribution company for years. Daniel had quietly mentioned once that it wasn't doing well. I hadn't thought much about it at the time. Now I was thinking about it. When my mother returned, she noticed my eyes on the stack of mail. Her expression changed for half a second, barely noticeable but enough. "You shouldn't touch other people's things," she said lightly. I nodded and leaned back in my chair. I wasn't. Silence lingered. Then my father came inside, wiping his hands on a towel that was already clean. "We're just worried about you," he said again, repeating the script. Something inside me clicked into place. "What are you worried about exactly?" I asked. They exchanged a look. "Managing that kind of money is overwhelming," my mother said carefully. "Especially when you're not thinking clearly." There it was again. Not thinking clearly. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I asked something simple. "Are you having financial problems?" The air shifted. My father stiffened. "That's none of your concern." It was the wrong answer. Because if this had truly been about my well-being, their finances wouldn't have been sensitive. But they were. I left shortly after, my heart pounding but my face composed. That night I couldn't sleep. So I did what Daniel had always done when something felt off. I researched. Public records are surprisingly accessible if you know where to look. Within 2 hours I found what I wasn't supposed to find. A lien had been filed against my father's business 6 weeks after Daniel's death. 6 weeks. There was also a notice of delinquency tied to their second mortgage. 3 months behind. And then there was something worse. A pending lawsuit from a supplier claiming unpaid invoices. The timeline lined up perfectly. Daniel passed away. The estate value was confirmed. Their financial pressure intensified. And suddenly I was mentally unstable. It wasn't random. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic. The guardianship petition would have given them control over my assets. Not ownership, but control. And with control comes influence, decision-making power, investment authority, temporary transfers, protective reallocations. If they had succeeded, they wouldn't have needed to steal outright. They could have simply managed things. Slowly, legally, quietly. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. I wasn't dealing with overprotective parents. I was dealing with desperation. And desperation makes people rationalize dangerous things. The next morning, I forwarded every document I found to my attorney. He called within an hour. "This changes everything," he said. "How bad is it?" I asked. "For them? Potentially very bad." He explained something I hadn't fully understood before. In guardianship cases, motive matters. Courts don't just evaluate the mental state of the person in question. They also assess whether the petitioners stand to benefit financially. And my parents stood to benefit enormously. If the court saw a clear financial incentive behind their petition, it would undermine their credibility. But we needed more than suspicion. We needed proof of intent. That proof came unexpectedly 3 days later. My mother called me late at night. Her voice sounded softer than usual. "We never wanted this to get ugly," she said. "It already is," I replied. She sighed. "If you would just let us help manage things temporarily, we could withdraw the petition." There it was. Not concern. Leverage. I didn't respond immediately. She continued. "Think about it. The evaluation. The court hearings. The public record. It doesn't have to go that far." She thought I would fold. She thought fear of being labeled unstable would scare me into compliance. Instead, I asked calmly, "So if I give you financial authority, you'll stop claiming I'm incompetent?" Silence. A long telling silence. "You're twisting my words," she said finally. No, I wasn't. And for the first time since this began, I felt something stronger than grief. Anger. Controlled. Focused anger. After we hung up, I saved the call log. I wrote down the time, the exact phrasing, every word I could remember. Because now I didn't just have financial motive. I had conditional pressure. They were willing to withdraw the accusation if I surrendered control. That wasn't protection. That was coercion. The next court date was approaching fast. And I had a feeling they didn't realize how much ground they were about to lose. The psychological evaluation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. My parents had pushed for it quickly, as if speed worked in their favor. Maybe they thought I would crumble under scrutiny. Maybe they believed grief would make me appear fragile enough to confirm their narrative. But grief and incompetence are not the same thing. The evaluation took place in a quiet office building downtown. Neutral walls. Soft lighting. The kind of environment designed to put people at ease, or expose them if they were unstable. I remember sitting in the waiting room thinking how absurd it was that I had to prove I was sane simply because I had lost my husband and inherited money. "Dear." Harris introduced herself professionally. No bias in her voice. No assumptions. Just questions. We spoke for nearly 3 hours. She asked about Daniel. About the day he died. About how I handled finances before and after his death. About my sleep patterns. My appetite. My support system. She asked if I had made any reckless financial decisions. I hadn't. She asked if I had transferred large sums impulsively. No. She asked whether I understood the scope of the estate. I listed every major asset from memory. Properties. Investment accounts. Business shares. Insurance payout amounts. She watched closely. Not looking for emotion. Looking for impairment. At one point she asked gently, "Do you believe anyone is trying to take advantage of you?" It was the only question that made me pause. Because answering it truthfully sounded paranoid. But answering it dishonestly would be naive. "I believe," I said carefully, "that there are financial incentives influencing certain people's actions." She nodded slowly and made a note. When the session ended, she didn't give me any indication of her opinion. Just a handshake and a professional smile. The waiting was worse than the evaluation itself. The report would be submitted directly to the court. Out of my hands. Out of my control. Meanwhile, my parents doubled down. My mother called relatives more frequently. My father mentioned to a family friend that I seemed detached from reality. Detached. Because I stopped engaging with them. Because I stopped giving them updates. Because I refused to sign anything. They were mistaking boundaries for breakdown. Or pretending to. 3 days later my attorney called. "They're in trouble," he said without greeting. My heart pounded. What happened? The evaluation came back. "You're fully competent. No signs of cognitive impairment. Normal grief response. Financial awareness intact." I closed my eyes. Not relief. Validation. The report even stated that any attempt to remove my financial autonomy would be clinically unwarranted. That sentence mattered. Because it shifted the case. This was no longer a question about my stability. It was about their motive. The next hearing felt different. When we entered the courtroom this time, my parents didn't look confident. They looked tense. Their attorney spoke first, attempting to downplay the evaluation. While the respondent may appear functional, he argued, emotional volatility can fluctuate. My lawyer stood calmly. "Your Honor," he said, "the clinical report is clear. There is no basis for guardianship." Then he introduced the financial records. The lien against my father's business. The delinquency notices. The pending lawsuit. The timeline. Filed after Daniel's death. He didn't accuse them directly. He didn't need to. The implication was heavy enough. The judge leaned forward. "Are the petitioners experiencing financial hardship?" he asked plainly. My father stiffened. "That's irrelevant." "It may not be," the judge replied. For the first time since this began, I saw uncertainty cross my mother's face. Then my attorney did something I hadn't fully prepared myself for. He referenced the phone call. Not a recording because in our state recording without consent was illegal. But my written documentation of it. "Your Honor, 3 days after the petition was filed, the petitioner suggested withdrawing the guardianship request if financial management authority was granted voluntarily." The courtroom went silent. My mother's head snapped toward me. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. The judge raised a hand. "Did you or did you not imply that the petition could be withdrawn in exchange for financial oversight?" Silence. That silence was louder than any confession. The judge made a note. And in that moment the energy in the room shifted completely. This was no longer about my mental health. This was about credibility. And they were losing it. The judge didn't rule immediately. Instead, he scheduled a final evidentiary review. But as we walked out, my father avoided looking at me. My mother tried once. Her expression wasn't pleading this time. It was calculating. They were reassessing. Because their strategy had collapsed faster than they expected. But something inside me told me they weren't done. Desperation doesn't disappear quietly. It escalates. And 3 days before the final hearing, they made one last move. A move that almost caught me off guard. Almost. 3 days before the final hearing, I received an email that almost made my hands shake. Almost. It was from my parents' attorney. The subject line read, "Settlement Proposal." I stared at it for a full minute before opening it. The message was polite, clinical, carefully worded. In light of recent developments, the petitioners are willing to voluntarily dismiss the guardianship request under certain agreed-upon conditions. Conditions. Attached was a proposed agreement. It didn't declare me incompetent anymore. It didn't request court control. Instead, it suggested creating a joint financial advisory structure, where my father would serve as a co-manager for a temporary period of 12 months. Temporary. That word appeared 4 times. The document claimed this structure would ease familial tensions and ensure responsible asset preservation during a period of emotional vulnerability. Emotional vulnerability. They had simply rebranded the accusation. My attorney called me within 15 minutes of forwarding it. "They're trying to salvage control without a ruling," he said. "Is it legal?" I asked. "Yes. But it's transparent." Transparent. That was generous. If I signed it, the petition would be withdrawn. No formal ruling. No written denial on record. The case would quietly disappear. And my father would gain access to my financial accounts. Temporary oversight. It was the same goal, just dressed differently. I leaned back in my chair. If I refuse, Then we proceed to final hearing. And given the evaluation and financial disclosures, their position is weak. Weak. But weak doesn't mean harmless. Because I knew something else now. They were desperate. And desperate people don't always think long-term. I declined the settlement within the hour. No negotiation. No edits. Just no. That evening my mother called. Her voice didn't sound soft anymore. "You're dragging this out," she said. "I didn't file anything," I replied calmly. "You did. You're humiliating us." That word almost made me laugh. Humiliation. As if I had publicly questioned their sanity. As if I had accused them of instability. As if I had tried to legally strip them of autonomy. "This didn't have to become public," she continued. "We were trying to protect you. You were trying to control me," I said quietly. There was a long pause. Then she said something that confirmed everything. "You don't understand what pressure does to people." Pressure. Not grief. Not concern. Pressure. I didn't ask her what she meant. Because I already knew. The business. The debts. The lien. They were cornered financially. And they had seen my inheritance as relief. We ended the call without resolution. 2 days later, the final hearing began. This time the courtroom felt different. Less dramatic. More decisive. The judge reviewed the psychological report again. He reviewed the financial timeline. He reviewed the settlement attempt. Then he looked directly at my parents. "Guardianship is a serious legal action," he said evenly. "It is not a financial planning tool." No one spoke. The court finds no evidence of mental incompetence. Furthermore, the financial circumstances presented raise concern regarding potential conflict of interest. Conflict of interest. Those words landed heavily. The petition is denied. Just like that. Denied. No temporary orders. No conditional supervision. Nothing. Then came the part one hadn't anticipated. Given the findings, the court will also consider whether the petition was filed in good faith. My parents' attorney shifted in his seat. Because filing a guardianship petition in bad faith, especially with financial motive, carries consequences. Sanctions. Legal fees. Public record implications. The judge didn't issue penalties immediately, but he ordered a review, which meant this wasn't disappearing quietly. When we stepped outside the courtroom, my parents stood a few feet away. My mother's eyes were red. My father looked older than I remembered. For a moment I wondered if they would apologize. They didn't. Instead, my father said, "You've made your choice." I met his gaze. "No," I replied calmly. "You did." They walked away without another word. I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt tired. Because winning doesn't undo betrayal. Just clarifies it. Over the next few weeks, the court ordered them to reimburse a portion of my legal fees due to lack of sufficient grounds for the petition. It wasn't financially devastating for them, but it was symbolic. A formal acknowledgement that they had overreached. Family reactions were mixed. Some relatives quietly apologized for believing the narrative. Others avoided me entirely, as if exposing manipulation had made me dangerous. I tightened everything. New financial advisor. Independent estate audit. Revoked any shared emergency contacts. Updated security protocols. Not because I feared immediate retaliation, but because trust, once broken like that, doesn't repair itself. Months passed. The legal case faded into background noise. But one question stayed with me. Would they ever admit what this was really about? That answer came unexpectedly one afternoon when my mother asked to meet for coffee. Alone. She said she just wanted to talk. No lawyers. No paperwork. Just talk. I almost declined. But something told me this conversation would be different. And I was right. Because what she said that day finally stripped away the last illusion of innocence. I chose a public place. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted neutrality. No childhood memories hanging on the walls. No family photographs staring down at us. Just a quiet cafe where no one knew our history. My mother was already seated when I arrived. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but emotionally. Like the confidence she had carried into that courtroom had drained out of her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I never thought it would go that far." That sentence told me everything. You filed a legal petition, I replied evenly. It was always going to go that far. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup but didn't drink. You don't understand what we were dealing with. There it was again. Pressure. I stayed quiet. Silence has a way of making people feel it. The business wasn't doing well, she admitted finally. We thought we could recover. We thought it would turn around. How much? I asked. She hesitated. More than we expected. That wasn't an answer. How much? I repeated. Her voice dropped. Almost $800,000. I absorbed the number slowly. $800,000 in debt. Loans. Suppliers. Credit lines. It made sense now. They weren't looking at my inheritance as greed. They were looking at it as survival. We weren't trying to steal from you, she said quickly. We just needed time. Stability. If we had managed things temporarily. Managed? I interrupted gently. Or redirected? Her eyes flickered. That was the closest she would ever come to admitting intent. You would have been taken care of, she insisted. It's not like we would have left you with nothing. Left me with nothing. As if generosity was the standard. As if my own money was negotiable. You tried to declare me mentally unfit, I said quietly. That's not temporary oversight. That's erasing someone. Her face tightened. It wasn't about you personally. That sentence hurt more than everything else. Because it meant I wasn't even the target. I was the asset. We were desperate, she whispered. And finally there it was. Not concern. Not protection. Desperation. I felt a strange calm settle over me. For months I had been replaying events, questioning myself, wondering if I had misinterpreted their actions. I hadn't. They saw an opportunity during a moment of vulnerability. They convinced themselves it was justified. They built a legal structure around that justification. And when it failed, they reframed it as misunderstanding. Why didn't you just ask for help? I asked. Her eyes filled with tears. Because you would have said no. She was right. I would have. Not because I lacked compassion, but because mixing that level of debt with my husband's estate would have been reckless. Daniel had built that money carefully, responsibly. He hadn't worked 70-hour weeks so it could become a bailout plan. And deep down my parents knew that. Which is why they didn't ask. They tried to control. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised me. Your father never wanted it to get legal. He thought you would agree once we explained. I almost laughed. They explained nothing. They filed first. Do you regret it? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. I regret how it happened, she said carefully. Not regret the attempt. Regret the outcome. That distinction mattered. When I stood to leave, she reached across the table instinctively. I don't want to lose you over this. I looked at her hand, then at her. You already did, I said softly. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just truthfully. Because something fundamental had shifted. Trust isn't just about honesty. It's about safety. And I no longer felt safe sharing vulnerability with them. As I walked to my car, I expected to feel sadness. Instead, I felt closure. The story wasn't about $4 million anymore. It was about autonomy. About how quickly grief can make someone a target. About how money doesn't change people, it reveals them. Over the next year, I rebuilt my life deliberately. I invested conservatively. I expanded one of Daniel's business ventures instead of selling it. I attended therapy not because I was unstable, but because betrayal leaves a different kind of scar. Slowly, peace returned. Not the naive peace I had before. A stronger one. Boundaries instead of assumptions. Documentation instead of blind trust. Independence instead of inherited loyalty. My parents and I speak occasionally now. Short conversations. Surface-level updates. No finances. No vulnerability. Some losses don't explode. They quietly rearrange the landscape. And sometimes the hardest truth to accept is this. The person who tries to take your power will always call it protection. But protection doesn't require erasing someone's voice. They thought I was too broken to fight back. They thought grief would cloud my judgment. They thought the label mentally unfit would scare me into surrender. Instead, it forced me to see clearly. My husband trusted me with his life's work. And in the end, I honored that trust. Not just by protecting the estate, but by protecting myself. The court case ended on paper, but the consequences didn't. About 6 weeks after the ruling, my attorney called again. The judge finalized the review, he said. The petition was determined to lack sufficient evidentiary basis. In plain English? I asked. It means the court believes it should never have been filed the way it was. There would be no criminal charges, no dramatic public punishment. But the court ordered my parents to cover a significant portion of my legal fees. It wasn't about the money. It was about the record. A formal acknowledgement that what they attempted crossed a line. Word travels fast in professional circles. My father's business reputation had already been fragile because of debt. Now there was a court-documented guardianship denial tied to his name. Suppliers became hesitant. Credit tightened. Pressure increased. And for the first time, the weight they had tried to shift onto me stayed exactly where it belonged. I didn't celebrate. I reorganized. I moved Daniel's liquid assets into structured trusts with clear legal boundaries. I hired an independent fiduciary, someone with no emotional connection to me or my family. Every account required dual authentication. Every advisory meeting was documented. Every decision recorded. Not because I feared another guardianship petition, but because clarity prevents opportunity. An opportunity in desperate hands becomes temptation. I also did something unexpected. I expanded one of Daniel's smaller ventures. It had been a side investment, a logistics software startup he believed in but never had time to grow personally. I reviewed the financials carefully. Stable, promising, scalable. Instead of selling it for quick liquidity, I funded its growth. Within 8 months, it doubled in valuation. For the first time since Daniel died, I felt something that wasn't grief or defense. I felt purpose. My parents noticed. Of course they did. Success makes noise. My father called one evening, his voice measured. I heard the company's doing well. It is, I said simply. That's good. A pause. Then, you've handled things better than we expected. There was no apology in his voice, just reluctant acknowledgement. I didn't respond with sarcasm. I didn't push, because validation from them wasn't something I needed anymore. What changed most wasn't my finances. It was my understanding of boundaries. Before all of this, I believed family loyalty was automatic. That blood relationships guaranteed protection. Now I understood something different. Loyalty requires integrity. Without integrity, loyalty becomes leverage. People often ask me, quietly, cautiously, if I regret not helping them financially when I had the chance. The answer is complicated. I don't regret protecting the estate, but I sometimes wonder whether desperation would have softened if they had simply been honest. If they had sat across from me at that same cafe and said, "We're in trouble. We don't know how to fix it." Maybe the conversation would have been different. Maybe we could have structured something limited, transparent, legal. But they didn't choose honesty. They chose control. And once someone attempts to legally remove your autonomy, the relationship never returns to its original shape. About a year after the court ruling, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, from my mother. Not legal, not strategic, just words. She wrote about regret, about fear, about how quickly things spiraled once the petition was filed. She admitted they believed I would agree quietly and avoid public proceedings. They underestimated me, not my intelligence, my resolve. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "We forgot you are stronger than you look." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not because it fixed anything, but because it closed something. Strength isn't loud. It's consistent. It shows up to evaluations. It organizes documentation. It refuses to sign agreements designed to erode control. It sits calmly in court while being called unstable. And it doesn't collapse when betrayal comes from inside the family. Today, when I walk through the home Daniel and I built together, I no longer feel like I'm guarding something fragile. I feel like I'm honoring something earned. The estate isn't just money. It's years of discipline, of shared plans, of trust. And in the end, that trust was tested in a way neither of us could have predicted. They tried to label me incompetent. They tried to question my judgment. They tried to frame protection as control. But the truth is simple. Grief did not weaken me, clarified me. And if there is one thing I learned through all of this, it's this. The moment someone needs you to believe you are incapable is often the moment you are strongest. It has been 2 years now. 2 years since I sat in that courtroom and heard my own parents describe me as mentally unstable. 2 years since I realized that grief can make you vulnerable, but money can make you a target. Life looks normal from the outside. The house is quiet. The business is thriving. The investments are stable. The legal documents are airtight. But internally, something fundamental changed. In the months after everything ended, I used to replay certain moments in my head. The funeral. The first time my mother asked about passwords. The envelope marked final notice. The settlement proposal. The silence in court when the judge asked about financial hardship. I used to wonder, when exactly did they decide? Was it a conversation late at night between them? Was it gradual? A thought that started as what if? And slowly justified itself into we have no choice? I'll never know. And strangely I've stopped needing to. Because closure didn't come from their apology. Came from my own clarity. The estate, which once felt like a burden layered on top of grief, eventually became something steadier. Not just wealth but responsibility. Structure. Intention. I created scholarship funds in Daniel's name. I invested in long-term community projects he believed in. I diversified assets in ways that protected not just capital but purpose. Money stopped being something I defended. It became something I directed. That shift was important, because for a long time I felt like I was reacting, defending, proving. Now I was choosing. The relationship with my parents settled into something polite but distant. We speak on holidays, short calls, careful topics, weather, health, neutral updates. No finances, no vulnerability. Trust doesn't shatter loudly. It fractures quietly. And sometimes, even when the pieces are put back together, you can still see the cracks. Last winter, my father experienced a minor health scare. Nothing life-threatening but serious enough to shake them. For the first time since the court case, he called me directly without agenda. His voice sounded older. I've been thinking a lot, he said. About what? He didn't specify at first. Then he did. I handled it wrong. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. But it was direct. I let fear make decisions, he continued. And I convinced myself it was for the right reasons. That was as close to accountability as I think he's capable of. I didn't forgive instantly. Forgiveness isn't a switch. But I acknowledged the statement. That's all I ever wanted, I told him. The truth. We didn't revisit the details. We didn't dissect the case. But that conversation felt different from the cafe meeting months earlier. It wasn't justification. It was admission. Desperation doesn't excuse harm. But understanding it makes the story less confusing. If there is one thing I want people to understand about situations like mine, it's this. Financial exploitation inside families rarely starts as villainy. Starts as rationalization. We're just helping. She can't handle this alone. It's temporary. It's for her own good. Those phrases sound harmless. Until they're backed by legal paperwork. Until they're used to remove someone's autonomy. Until they almost succeed. Looking back, I don't think my parents ever saw themselves as villains. They saw themselves as cornered. And when people feel cornered, they convince themselves that survival justifies strategy. But there's a line. And once you cross into legally questioning someone's competence without medical basis, you can't pretend it was just concern. You weaponize doubt. You leverage vulnerability. You try to redefine someone's grief as incapacity. That changes everything. Today, when people ask how I stayed calm through the evaluation, the hearings, the accusations, I tell them something simple. Because I knew the truth. Truth doesn't panic. It documents. Prepares. It waits. They thought labeling me unstable would intimidate me. They thought I would settle quietly to avoid embarrassment. They thought I would prioritize family harmony over personal autonomy. They miscalculated. Not because I'm extraordinary, but because I refused to let fear make my decisions the way it made theirs. Daniel once told me something during a conversation about business partnerships. If someone needs to weaken you to gain control, he said. They were never offering protection. I didn't fully understand that sentence then. I do now. The estate remains intact. The investments are secure. The business continues to grow. But the real victory was never financial. It was this. They tried to take my voice in the moment I was grieving, and I kept it. They tried to redefine me as incapable, and I stood steady. They thought I was too broken to fight back. Instead, I learned exactly how strong I was. People assume the hardest part was the courtroom. It wasn't. The hardest part was the quiet afterward. When the hearings ended. When the lawyers stopped calling. When the adrenaline drained out of my system. That's when the emotional weight settled in. Because legal victory doesn't automatically restore emotional safety. For a long time, I questioned myself in ways I never admitted publicly. Was I too cold? Should I have helped them differently? Could I have prevented it by offering something small early on? Grief does strange things to your thinking. It makes you second-guess even your strength. But every time doubt crept in, I returned to one simple fact. They didn't ask. They filed. That distinction matters more than people realize. As the months turned into years, I started speaking privately with others who had faced similar situations. Widows, adult children, individuals who inherited businesses or property, and suddenly found themselves treated differently. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. The moment significant assets appear, dynamics shift. Concern becomes advice. Advice becomes pressure. Pressure becomes paperwork. And paperwork once filed becomes power. Most of them told me the same thing. I never thought my own family would do that. Neither did I. But I also learned something else. Financial boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. If I had signed that temporary oversight agreement to keep the peace, it would not have stopped there. Access expands. Authority grows. And reversing it later becomes infinitely harder. What protected me wasn't anger. It was documentation. It was staying calm during the evaluation. It was refusing to be emotionally baited into reactive decisions. It was understanding that the loudest accusation doesn't equal truth. The word mentally unfit sounds catastrophic. But in court it requires evidence. And evidence can't be manufactured out of grief alone. Today, when I walk into financial meetings, I do so confidently. Not because I know everything, but because I know how to ask the right questions. I know how to protect what matters. And I know that vulnerability is something to guard wisely. My relationship with my parents exists in a quieter space now. We are civil. We are careful. We do not discuss money. There are no joint decisions. No shared financial visibility. Some people would say that's sad. Maybe it is. But peace built on boundaries is still peace. And sometimes maturity means accepting that certain closeness cannot be restored without compromising self-respect. The $4 million estate that once felt like a spotlight now feels like background structure. Supports my life. It funds long-term plans. It sustains the ventures Daniel believed in. But it no longer defines me. What defines me is how I responded when it was threatened. When someone tries to convince you that you are incapable, your first instinct may be to defend yourself emotionally, to argue, to plead, to prove yourself in dramatic ways. But the most powerful response is often the quietest one. You gather facts. You stay steady. You let truth stand without panic. That steadiness unsettles manipulation more than outrage ever could. I often think back to that first courtroom day. The judge reading the petition. The word incompetent echoing in a room full of strangers. If I could speak to that version of myself, the woman sitting there in disbelief, I would tell her this. You are not being tested because you are weak. You are being tested because you are capable. People rarely attempt control where there is nothing valuable to gain. And value isn't just money. It's independence, autonomy, decision-making power, the right to direct your own future. That's what they were really trying to access. Not just an estate, authority over me. And in the end, that was the one thing I refused to surrender. The story people expected was dramatic collapse. Grieving widow overwhelmed by sudden wealth. Family steps in to save her. Instead, the story unfolded differently. Grieving widow documents carefully. Underestimation becomes exposure. Control attempt becomes legal defeat. Strength reveals itself quietly. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't about distrust. It's about discernment. Not everyone who calls something protection has your best interest at heart. And not every challenge that looks like an attack is meant to destroy you. Sometimes it forces you to see clearly. They called me mentally unfit. But what they truly underestimated was my clarity. And clarity, once awakened, doesn't disappear. It sharpens. It strengthens. It stays.